thank you all for joining us for our weekly community conversations. This week, we're delighted to kick off a new series on leading in a time of change in partnership with our good colleagues and friends at the Capital Region, BOCES. And to kick it off, the conversation today, which I think is absolutely appropriate given the situations we're dealing with, which is remote learning, resources, and digital equity. We've got experts here from the School of Education and Cap Region BOCES. We're going to introduce them in a minute. First, though, we've just got a few announcements we wanted to share about what's going on here with the community conversations as we move forward this summer. My name is Jason Lane. I have the great privilege of being the Dean of the School of Education here at the University of Albany. We kicked off the community conversation series several weeks ago now as an opportunity to bring together K-12 and higher education to talk about the critical issues that are affecting all of education as we grapple with the pandemic and all of its impacts in a myriad ways. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Joe Dragone. And Joe, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, come off mute here like an amateur. We haven't been doing this for the past 3.5 months. Thank you, Jason, and good afternoon, everyone. And it's great to be here. It's great to be here with some folks on my team as we start this leadership sessions over the past over the next few months as we go through the summer. And thank you to the University of Albany School of Education, Jason, and all your work on coordinating these. And we're looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So there's a few things we just wanted to share with folks. This started initially as an effort by the faculty and staff in the School of Education to try to leverage our expertise in online learning to work with K-12 to think about ways that we could pivot to this new remote learning experience. As part of that, we stood up a new website, which was called Remote Education Resource Hub. You can find it here, remoteed.org. And it's really a curated list of resources available online for free. That it's organized by subject matter and grade level, and provides a host of other information about how do you start moving online, how do you think about structuring online courses or remote courses, and begins to get into issues around sort of how do we think about issues of equity and inclusion when we're in this new space, how do we think about helping those with special needs move online, how do we deal with, how do we help parents think about their new role. So it's a great and robust resource in a variety of ways. Cap Region BOCES has also set up a wonderful resource here. And Joe, if you want to talk about Essential Ed for a minute.
Great, thank you. We'll be getting into a lot more detail as we go through the conversation. We've got the architect of Essential Ed with us today, our Deputy Superintendent, Lauren Gemmel, working with regional leaders. And again, this is for teachers by teachers, district representation across the region, creating tools, resources, all standard aligned pieces that they can plug and play as we switch to remote learning. So we'll get into an in-depth piece of that in a little bit.
So as you hear more, I encourage you to check out both those resources moving forward. Coming up next, just to sort of give you a heads up of what will be happening, July 8th will be the next continuation of this leadership series, and we'll be talking about the pandemic preparedness for the health, wellness, and safety in public schools for the 2021 academic year. And then in August, we'll be looking at a conversation, which is what will K-12 schools look like in New York this fall, and perhaps we'll actually have more information by then, because I know we're all in contingency planning at the moment to figure out what will fall actually look like. So that'll be a timely conversation come August. In addition to the leadership series that we're kicking off now, two of our colleagues, Alex Peterson and Elena Gordis, are looking at issues of mental health. And so June 17th will be another community conversation around stress and collective trauma to kick off that series about how individuals are dealing with the mental health implications of COVID-19. And I know, obviously, given everything that's happening around us with the protests and riots around equity and inclusion, that's very much part of the thinking around that series as well. This year also, we are bringing back the second annual School Safety Summit, or Safe, Prepared, and Effective Learning Environment Summit. Given where we are, it's going to be digital this year. Last year, we held it in August. We had about 150 people join us in the Albany Convention Center. This year, it will be open to everybody again, and a series of extended events, morning events, but the first session here on July 23rd, how to safely reopen your school buildings, campuses, and classrooms. On July 30th, the pandemic related to psychological first aid and recovery for students and staff. And then on August 6th, the Phantom Menace, keeping students and schools safe in cyberspace. So a lot of things coming up in the summer to keep us all busy as we are continuing to be at home in this remote learning environment. But now we get to turn to the real focus of today. And I'll introduce the folks here from the School of Education, and then Joe, I'll let you introduce the folks from Cap Region BOCES. But we're joined by Dr. Alex Kingiaboa, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Theory and Practice, who has done a lot of research on online learning and digital learning, particularly in communities, refugee communities, and other impoverished communities around the U.S. and has great insights about sort of issues of how to think about education and equity. And Dr. Peter Shea, who's a professor in the Educational Theory and Practice Department, as well as the Associate Provost for Online Learning here at the University at Albany, and really a globally recognized leader in online and remote education as well. So we're excited to have both of them here with us. Joe?
Great, thanks, Jason. And I'm thrilled that members of my team can join us today. They really are the experts. And we have Lauren Gemmel, as I mentioned before, our Deputy District Superintendent. Everything on the curriculum and instruction side, and has been instrumental in making sure that we have the resources and the folks have the skills to implement those resources from an instructional perspective. And we have two guests on the technical side. Mike Dowdy, who is the Assistant Superintendent of NARIC, which is the Northeastern Regional Information Center. People may not know, we run the network and the back end and all that fun IT stuff from the Canadian border out to Utica, down to Ulster County, and then west to the Mass and Vermont borders. So we have a huge district that we cover and support in terms of IT, 144 plus districts, 7 BOCES, 15 counties, I believe. So it's very widespread, it's very diverse, and we support them through NARIC in everything that's IT, and nothing is more important than that now with the interest in distance learning. And also I'd like to introduce Mike Solowski, who is our manager of everything e-learning services. We've been doing distance learning before there was distance learning, frankly. In the late 90s, back when you had a 36-inch tube TV in a classroom, we were running distance learning programs. Mike has been at the helm of that for many, many years. He's the expert. It was statewide recognition of the work that he leads through our division with everything distance learning. So looking forward to hearing from everyone. And I'll turn it back to you, Jason.
Great. Thanks, Joe. So obviously this session is about digital education and equity, and we chose those topics because we think they're critical for the remote learning environment, but obviously everything we do in education, we need to be thinking about issues of equity and the disparate impact that different decisions can make. And I think there's no doubt that we need to be thinking even more critically about these issues given the environment that has transpired in the last couple of weeks, which really are just a tip of the iceberg in terms of highlighting, I think, a lot of the issues around structural racism and discrimination in all aspects of society. And as we think about COVID-19 and its impact, we know that the issues of equity have further been exacerbated in the community in general, in health-related issues, and obviously in education for many disadvantaged communities. And so we've got to be thinking very carefully about these things and what ways that we can move forward in that space. So the first question really deals specifically with this issue, and we've asked our panelists, we identified some lead panelists to respond initially, and then invite others to jump in as they wish. But we know that equity in education is an ongoing concern, and the current situation has only exacerbated these issues, right? For example, we know the pandemic has disproportionately affected minority communities. Are we seeing in education similar types of disparate impact on historically disenfranchised groups? And we'll ask first here Alex Kingiaboa to respond, as he's really, I think, been studying this for a period of time. Alex? No, Alex, you're on mute.
On mute.
Nope. Oh, you were good there for a minute. Still on mute. There you go.
Yeah, hello everyone. Very interesting question. Digital equity, from my research, didn't start up because of this pandemic. It's been there for a long time because of access to, it used to be access to the internet, and then it, kind of move on to the access to the laptop. The other reason is it depends on the school district that you are in. If you are in a suburban school district, you are most likely to get a one laptop, one student, and then that will facilitate the minority or the student of color or the kid coming from a low-income home access to the internet, and then also the laptop. Most school districts in the United States, probably more than 80%, they do have a program where the most homework and other assignments are done through the Google Classroom and other softwares where students can go in and do their assignments. The problem is that because of the finances and the financial issues in the urban school district, especially in the South. If I say in the South, I'm talking about the South of the United States. A lot of school districts cannot have budget for one laptop, one school, sometimes including even teachers. So that has been a big problem and most urban schools, I'm sorry I didn't say that, most urban schools proportionally have higher percentage of minority students. And that has really derailed the academic performance based on the interviews that I've done so far. There's something that, for example, there's something that is going on in Florida, which is very strange as comparing to what I've just said. Because of the other issues that we cannot talk about, because it's a whole discussion itself, a lot of minority students are being picked up in the classroom for disciplinary issues. So most minority students actually prefer to go online, the K-12 online school system in Florida. I can only talk about Florida. And then the study that came out was that because they are doing online classes, this time they didn't have any disciplinary issues, and they were doing well in school because there was that kind of monitoring from parents and then also teachers who teach them online. So that kind of support the fact that if minority students or students of color or students coming from a low socioeconomic status home, if they do have access to laptop, then it becomes a big boost for their academic performance. And then are we seeing similar? Yeah, the pandemic also has created a whole bigger or has brought us into this conversation of how to increase access to laptop for minorities. So far, I don't recollect any. I think initially Troy had issues with that, but they were able to solve it quickly. A lot of students didn't have access to the internet at home. So they were asked to go to the local libraries, and then the pandemic became an issue that social distance issues. So the libraries were also closed. So I think what I heard was that immediately they were able to find some laptop for these students. So it has brought up a new financial issue for among the school district. And from my point of view, I would say that everything is more to do with the financial issue. And we have a subtenant. When it comes to school budgeting, it's a whole big issue that they deal with. So as a researcher in that field, I only advocate that when they're doing a budget, they should always advocate or have a percentage for students that do not have access to laptop or computer at home so that they can have access to the computer. The good news is that on the average in the United States, access to computer is very, very high as compared to other countries. And a lot of school districts, for example, in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and some part of Texas, initially 10, 20 years ago, were not, a big fan of online learning or remote learning. But these days, because of I would say online remote learning makes it so easy for the kids because their age is more to do with it. They use a lot of digital technologies. So most school districts are encouraging the use of remote learning. And in Florida, I think is tops the nation. They have close to 1 million students before the pandemic in online learning. Michigan, Georgia, and then Arizona, they have, and I think Alabama, they have huge number of students in online, starting from first grade up to 12th grade. New York and California and other states, because of the bureaucracy, the quality of online learning, so they are very tough giving license for people to set up our online schools. So that's what I would say for now.
Great, thanks, Alex. I appreciate that. I think you highlighted some important points there on disparate impact related to internet access, related to types of technology, but I think also a really important finding came out of Florida, which means for some students who have been more disadvantaged in schools, the shift to online and learning at home has actually been a positive for them, in their academic achievement. So I appreciate all those perspectives. Thinking about the next question here, we moved very, very quickly to remote learning, and I'll ask Peter and Mike S. Your thoughts on sort of what have been the most significant challenges that were faced as we made this shift to online learning.
I guess I'll jump in, Jason. Typically in an area of leadership, one of the principles that we talk about is creating a sense of urgency. And in this particular crisis, nobody needed to create a sense of urgency. A sense of urgency came full at us without any effort on our part. And so there was a tremendous amount of urgency to do things that we typically don't do, and to do them in very short order. So I would say, some of the challenges that we confronted were challenges of scope and challenges of time and challenges of preparedness, challenges of resources. We had, in many cases, a week to 2 weeks to move every course in the university from a classroom environment to a remote environment. I hesitate to use the word online learning. My background in research and development and teaching in online environments precludes me from calling this full online learning. I think it was really better called emergency remote instruction. But nobody was prepared for this. So I think one of the biggest challenges we had was preparation. Faculty who had spent their careers doing a great job in a classroom were suddenly confronted with moving fully online. And again, the amount of time we had to do it was incredibly brief. And I think the topic of the discussion today is leadership and equity and inclusion. But I would just say that so many folks stepped up and filled leadership positions very quickly, or had leadership positions and exercised incredible leadership, from our president, from our provost, from the deans of the colleges to chairs to faculty, who undertook a tremendous task and did it in incredibly rapid time with, I think, a very positive outcome overall. Students continue to learn, faculty continue to teach, the university continued to operate despite a global pandemic. I think there were some specific challenges that we had to confront, things around the necessary to be more flexible with course requirements, and the needs to be, things as specific as final exams. How are we going to conduct final exams all online? We looked at our learning management system, Blackboard, and suddenly we're confronted with what we might have a few hundred courses doing online exams at the end of a term to every course in the university, potentially simultaneously, in 1 week or 10 days, doing all exams for every student. And that presented a potential overload on the Blackboard servers. But again, people stepped up, added additional capacity, rebalanced the load on the servers, rebalanced the distribution of final exams, and things like that are just, small examples. But for every faculty, for every course, for every student, there was just a dramatic change. And I think that kind of change in change management represented a pretty significant challenge for us.
Great. Mike, how about you?
Yeah, I think what Peter outlined is definitely, some of the technical considerations, some of the policy changes and grading practices are definitely ones that schools had to grapple with pretty significantly. Where we were spending a lot of time with our team and working with our colleagues is really on the human component and within that change management. And really, I think it was Keith Kruger. He's the CEO of the Consortium of School Networking, which is an ed tech organization nationwide. He posted something very quickly after the schools had closed that really resonated with me. He said, ed tech is a requirement, not a choice. And that was a really big shift, I think, in thinking on how this could look. Because I think our practice had been to date is with teachers in particular, is that if teachers were, they would use the right tool for the right type of application. And sometimes that would, there was a lot of value in using educational technology tools, but sometimes it didn't necessarily mean that you would use those. And when it's a choice, teachers would tend to gravitate to what they were more comfortable with. And then often, in many cases, we were finding that you had teachers that were a little bit ahead of the curve and would be willing to integrate technology in along with in-person activities. But you also had other instructors who maybe weren't as comfortable with ed tech. And now all of a sudden, they all had to become comfortable with educational technology. And so that challenge in of itself from the human perspective of having to shift all of what you've done for many, many years, potentially with some of our teachers, into this online format was one that more than anything, at least from our team's support, was one that was significant and created a lot of challenges for teachers. In addition to that, you also have the other stakeholders that are really heavily involved with this, with really on the ground, the instruction that's happening. So you have parents now who are working, and at the same time now they're having to support their students in a way, and their children in a way that they hadn't been able to do before, or they hadn't had to necessarily before when the students were at school. And so when you have parents juggling both their work and also trying to help students who, and if you have 3 or 4 students in your household, then that's a pretty significant undertaking. And then I would say on top of that, beyond all that, is you have the students themselves. And while students are definitely very comfortable and become significantly comfortable in this culture of digital technologies, it's one thing to be a consumer of technology and to use it in a social way. It's another thing to be forced to do this on a daily basis, to be self-disciplined and be really independent in your work. And there are some students that are very capable of that, but nonetheless, that's still a significant challenge for many of our students. And you're going all the way down from, obviously you have high school students where that can be a challenge with all of their workload, down to asking kindergartners and first graders to in essence take on more of their own learning. And while teachers did at the absolute best they could to connect in these environments, unless you've done it, it is a significant challenge. And so that all that human component of remote learning, to Peter's point, because that's what it is. It's remote learning. This is not necessarily online learning with fidelity. This is remote learning. That shift for all of our stakeholders was one that I would argue we're continuing to grapple with, and will be throughout the summer, and upon reentry, we're going to continue to grapple with those concerns.
Great. So thinking now about varying levels of access, which is something Alex highlighted earlier about sort of the disparate impact on different communities in particular. But we know that different families, different students have different levels of internet access and technology. And Mike D and Peter, maybe just give us a couple of examples each about how you all have addressed this issue of different levels of access. So Mike, start with you.
Yeah, sure. Yep. I think one of the things is to get the systems working together. And in New York, where we have 700 different school districts and no real county superstructure like districts in the South, the BOCES was uniquely positioned to help. So to organize different constituent groups together to make sure that everybody had access to the same information, so the adults who were doing this work, making sure that we could leverage the power of the cooperative, really, especially when it comes to purchasing devices on behalf of districts and supporting that sort of back end work. I think that was a big piece of it. A lot of it did depend on the individual school district. If you had a school district where they had already gone one-to-one, that was pretty easy for them. There were other ones who had to place orders for thousands of Chromebooks. And then, you know, we support with the ordering and helping them get them configured and with technical support and things like that. But it really varied district to district. In terms of the internet, again, a lot of distributing hotspots, you know, helping districts purchase and distribute those, looking at different options of even web-enabled Chromebooks, things like that. There were a lot of things that it was kind of piecemeal, you know, and I think people were grasping for whatever they could, and we tried to at least put some structure and support and a system around that.
Great. Peter, anything you want to add?
I would echo Mike's comments that it was a bit piecemeal given the amount of time we had to put things in place. I think one of the things that we confronted were students without reliable internet access. And one way to address that was through an instructional design strategy. Rather than being overly dependent on high bandwidth synchronous instruction, we're trying to coax folks into doing more sophisticated instructional design approaches that leveraged asynchronous online learning that allowed students who are sharing connections or sharing connectivity or devices to be able to do things in a more timely way when it fit into their ability to access the technology. But we're still struggling, I think, with students who don't have great internet access and the ability to reach out across the state to get to students who are still without great internet access. I think some of the principles that we're trying to give voice to the faculty was try to keep things simple, be flexible. And I happen to work as an editor of a journal and just recently published a national study that looked at how universities confronted the challenges around COVID-19 and the instructional changes that were made. The majority of higher education faculty across the country did make significant adjustments to their teaching and to their assessment and to their instructional design and to their expectations. And I think that's something that the president of our university was vocal about, that we need to be flexible, that we need to be compassionate, and we need to be understanding. We need to have these sort of high-level principles from a leadership perspective, rather than sticking to some letter of the law with regard to every single requirement that's typical. So that's what all I would add at this point.
Thank you both. You know, I was on a reimagining education discussion. They were gathering feedback, and one of our colleagues, Kim Stein, who used to work at the Florida Virtual School, also brought up the idea that sometimes you can go too high tech in trying to create access, and some of the strategies that have been used elsewhere in virtual high schools have been to go low tech, and actually going back to phone calls and other sorts of ways that engage people that don't require internet access, but actually utilize phone lines and thinking more about other sorts of ways to engage people. So I thought it was interesting perspective also that there's both the high tech and the low tech ways to try to engage people from a remote perspective. I think somebody else is trying to get in. Maybe not. Okay, I'm hearing things. So moving on to think about sort of, again, different populations of learners. And we know that, both students with disabilities and students where English is not their first language have particular needs that we need to be dealing with. And Lauren here first, but Alex, you've dealt a lot with refugee communities as well. So maybe when Lauren's done, I ask you just to reflect on sort of what you learned from your research of those communities. Lauren?
Thanks, Jason. First and foremost, I think when March 13th came out and we sent home our students across the capital region, especially when we're talking about our students with disability and English language learners, our teachers immediately did contact with parents, right? So before we can even move into that new instructional zone, we needed to make sure that communication was open and that those relationships that our teachers have with our parents and students came through to make sure that they were okay and ready to learn. As senior leadership of instruction across the region, we started meeting with the 24 assistant superintendents on a daily basis. And as we started talking about instruction for those two groups in particular, we talked about the importance of that co-planning with the general education teacher. So that naturally happens when you're in the school environment, but it becomes a little bit harder when you're in this remote situation. That really was the purpose of the Essential Ed website, was to have teachers work on identifying those essential skills. So once the general education teacher had those essential skills, it's imperative that our English, our ENL teachers and our special ed teachers did that co-planning with the gen ed teachers to hone in on what exactly did that student need academically, and then be able to deliver that. One of the things I think we learned very quickly, or teachers learned very quickly, was you can't take your in-person instruction and just move it into a remote space. And so in addition to the communication, we now had to work through who's delivering what instruction. Again, when we think about our elementary students, having them on devices 3, 4, 5 hours a day isn't going to work. So having our ENL and special ed teachers work with the gen ed teachers to talk about who's delivering it and how they're delivering it. On the Essential Ed website, we have a page dedicated to modifying units, and that's really to support those teachers and looking at the curriculum that a general education teacher may be delivering to their class, and then taking that unit of instruction and modifying it down to the particular needs of those English language learners or special education students.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And Alex, anything you want to add from your research on this? I don't know if you're there. There you are, Alex.
Yeah. Okay. Is it okay now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, to add what she just add, I think it's to make it a concise statement. It's more to do with I'll add the teacher awareness of who those students are. Sometimes honestly it's a hassle when somebody just immigrated from Afghanistan, or from Sudan in Africa, or from Nicaragua in South America. They just thrown into a new system of education. That itself is the first challenge. And most of these students are also not coming from places where technology is not up to the standard as compared to here. So it gives the teacher an extra work to do. I don't mean to be... students always argue with me because they've not traveled outside the United States. When it comes to issues like this, of all the challenges and criticisms, as a matter of fact, United States is actually the #1 in the world when it comes to educating refugees and other immigrant students. Because I have families in Italy and other places, and Germany, they don't have that. So to that being said, I always advocate for the teacher awareness about the cultures and the educational system where those students are coming from is very, very important. And then also, I'll add that kids learn very well informally in the digital age. So with time and with constant teacher awareness and the strategies or the methods that they're going to use to teach, whether English or science or social studies, with time, those students pick up very well. But if you talk to immigrant students and refugees, it's like, I'm in a new system. They don't understand who I am so that they can cater for me through this method. Even though I'm so good at math, but because I have accent, they think I am not good, so they are giving me something that I take very easy to do it, but they're still emphasizing on the English. You students coming from Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, and Sudan, their first language, native language, their first language is actually English. So by grammar and other things, they are so good, but immediately the faces with the accent, I am not from here, then technically it means you are academic standard, you are not good. But then they claim that I'm good, it's just that I speak with accent and I don't know the procedures. So if they can help me with the school procedure, the classroom procedure, and then what to do, that will really help. So that is what I have observed. And then honestly, when it comes to the use of the technology, they are not good as the United States kids. So I think when teachers are aware of this, then they can cater for the strategies, the methods that they are going to use. But that being said, most school districts are doing very well to cater for my immigrants and refugee students.
It's a great point of sort of thinking about sort of the differences between sort of where people come from and their English and their academic ability, and particularly coming here and having to understand a system. And if they came into our system in the midst of COVID-19, even more difficult to try to figure out how the world works. So, and we're going to get back to this issue of parents' engagement, family engagement in a minute. But a question now for Mike and Peter. But what are the tools and resources that are available out there to support distance or remote learning moving forward? Where should teachers be looking for resources so that they can, I think regardless of what fall looks like, there'll be some form of remote most likely involved. So where do they go to get help and assistance? Mike?
I'll start then. Yeah, there's a handful of I'd say web resources is a good place to start, and I know Lauren mentioned the Essential Ed website that was developed within Cap Region BOCES, and that is and the districts in the area here, and it's really a remarkable website because it has so many rich resources pulled together so quickly to help teachers on organizing their thinking and really focusing on what matters and the important standards that they need to have students meet. So from an instructional perspective, it's really a remarkable resource. Our team also developed a couple of other additional resources, and I could put them in the chat room afterwards. It was more of a repository of virtual learning tools that teachers could consider using based on what would be appropriate for the type of activity that they were looking to focus on. And we also worked with our colleagues in the special education department to develop a teletherapy site to help provide some guidance to educators of students with special needs who in many respects were not ones that had been using technology as much, and clearly much of what they did was in person, and now we're transitioning them to a remote environment. So I can put a couple of those links in the chat room. What I would say, generally speaking, from an instructional tool perspective, you ask 10 different teachers, they'll give you 10 different tools. I think what we found have been very effective tools are in two categories. One are platforms, and that would be like a learning management system. Peter mentioned Blackboard. Many of our schools use Schoology. Google Classroom is more of a content management system that many of our schools are using. And even at the say elementary level, there's a platform called Seesaw that has become very popular. It's more of a portfolio platform, but more designed for our younger students. So those platforms have been really, really helpful. And then online conferencing tools. We're in Zoom today. Our team supports WebEx. Google Meet is another one that's been used heavily. And being mindful of access being a consideration for schools, what the feedback we've been finding is that those online conferencing tools are really critical in maintaining that relationship and giving students an ability to connect with their peers and connect with their teachers in a synchronous way, which as much as the access is something to be mindful of, that synchronous connection is really critical to the learning experience.
Peter?
I think Mike's covered it pretty well in terms of tools. I would just quickly share my screen, if I can find it, yeah, and show some of the tools and resources that the University of Albany has created. I know this remote ed has been a topic of discussion in previous sessions, but I just wanted to give a shout out to all the tools and resources that are available on the Academy for the Advancement of Teaching Leadership in Schools from the School of Education at the University of Albany, including upcoming summer camps, resources on equity and inclusion, getting started with remote teaching, information for parents, right down to resources by subject level, resources by grade. Just a tremendous amount of work has been done to try to help the community from the School of Education. And it's been led in part by faculty, but also by graduate students in the School of Ed. So I just wanted to give a real shout out to folks who have been instrumental in creating this resource for our community. I would just amplify what Mike was saying, that there's sort of two different approaches, platforms, and those platforms can be either synchronous or asynchronous, and they kind of meet different needs. The kind of research that I've done has focused on how do we recreate the sort of epistemic or knowledge building processes that occur in classrooms, but to do that when people are not together in real time. And part of recreating these epistemic processes have to do with recreating a sense of instruction or a presence, a teaching presence, or Mike was talking about a little bit about this, the sort of support and social support folks need can be recreated through effectively, frequently through synchronous, I think judicious use of synchronous instruction. But really keeping your eye on the big picture is the learning and being able to recreate these epistemic processes using those technologies and those tools. So I'll just stop there.
Great, thank you both. So I think, Joe, I'm gonna turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks, Jason. Professional development. It's interesting that the old joke is, you know, a teacher's never had a student who said, I need your help learning this technology. It's always the other way. So I think that the switch that we had to make so quick has created some multi-dimensional professional development or learning support problems. One is with using mediums, and two is being able to assimilate the resources, access the resources, and use the resources. So I guess I'd like to turn to Lauren first and talk about the resources that are in place and how those can be in place to support teachers as they work remotely.
Sure, thanks, Joe. You know, one of our divisions at Cap Region Boches is ESS, which is educational support. And so all of our folks that work in that division have been really working to provide professional development opportunities for teachers in this time. I had mentioned before that we have a daily call with our senior leadership from across districts, and so they've been a direct line as to what additional support and development do teachers need. You know, we've had workshops that have just allowed teachers from across the region to come together and support each other in practice and problem solving. We've had focused workshops on determining essential skills that need to happen at this point in time, how to collect evidence. That's been a big one. So we talked about we really weren't prepared for this. And so teachers went into this remote setting and they're providing instruction, but how do we provide opportunities for students to demonstrate that learning in a variety of ways? So we've had workshops on that, really just trying to support teachers in this new way of teaching. You know, we started the conversation with recognizing that we have students in all different environments, and we have asynchronous and synchronous learning that's happening. And for a teacher who traditionally has those students sitting in front of them in the classroom to move to a location where potentially they're not having that direct contact as routinely to be able to check in and see that evidence of learning from students, that's a whole new ball game. And so all of those different topics, from identifying what we're teaching in this location, how we're teaching it in this location, how we're receiving feedback from students and continuing to provide additional support to students, were all areas that we needed to provide workshops around in order to support teachers in the Capital Region. And I'm really proud to say that in our ESS department, we were able to provide workshops for over 4 to 6 weeks that just had ongoing opportunities during the day for folks to sign in and to participate, that worked with their schedule. And, you know, Mike's team with the RIC, they've done a really nice job of supporting us in some of those instructional workshops to weave in those technology tools that would help teachers as well.
Thanks, Lauren. And I guess that's a great segue to Mike. If you can talk about it, you know, we went from 60, 65 schools that use distance learning and remote learning to just in our region, 150 plus. We went to several hundred WebEx licenses for access, to several thousand with our partner at Cisco overnight. Talk about PD from an IT perspective and helping people to learn to navigate these environments.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It was when the schools closed, it was a whirlwind first few weeks of support and professional development for for everyone. This was teachers, this was students, this was administrators, various stakeholders within school districts about how to basically transform these activities from in-person to a remote virtual format with technology. And so we spent a great deal of time doing a lot of tool-based training right off the bat, is just to the extent you can virtually holding hands of teachers and administrators and other school stakeholders to get them comfortable with using the technology and with some level of fidelity, right? So that first month to 6 weeks was largely about focusing on the platforms and the tools. What we're starting to see, although it's still evolving, is you're starting to see more of the focus in the areas that Lauren was talking about, which are more pedagogical in nature. It's talking about good instructional practice, utilizing maybe some of these technologies, as well as some other non-technical ways to be really providing learning with fidelity in this remote environment. So we'll see how that continues to evolve. I think we're always going to be continuing to have to support teachers who need to be able to crawl before they can walk when it comes to the tools. But as people get more comfortable with these tools and they become easier to use, I think our focus is starting to shift towards more of those pedagogical areas of focus.
Great. Absolutely, Mike. I mean, it's this intersection between the access and using the tools and being able to convey that from a pedagogical perspective. And I think you had a really good point earlier too, regarding learning management systems, content management systems, and the backbones that drive a lot of stuff. And they're very disparate, and I think, which makes it that much harder for us to make sure we're providing support along a bunch of different lines. We're going to switch gears just a little bit. And actually, Jerry, if you don't mind, if you can advance one more, I want to kind of talk about 7 and 8 a little bit together, because just to be cognizant of the time and the interrelationship between those. And one, it's a question of communication and support. And when it comes to communication and support, the parallel work that goes through with social, emotional. We've been spending the past, I don't know how many days, talking about special education summer school, which has been a very hot topic, and the governor just flipped on his decision with that, has put tremendous amount of stress on school districts, and these matters of social emotional support and supporting students and families and communication are really interrelated. So I guess I would shape it under those two things, and I'll go to ask Lauren first just to talk a little bit about that, and ask Mike Dowdy to talk about the relationship with that with some of the remote summer school stuff. So I'll go to Lauren first.
Sure. So that's definitely been, I think one of the things that keeps all educators up at night, right, is the fact of the mental health and the needs of our students. We have students that we routinely know come in and do check-ins with our counselors and our support staff on a daily basis. And so now we've had to flip that and reach out to those students in any means possible. And that's what we've seen educators do, right? So we've seen educators reach out to or social workers reach out to their students and have that regular conversation still. We've had administrators and social workers do home visits to make sure that we're able to support students and make sure they're safe. It really has been all hands on deck and anything to make sure that students are safe and healthy. We've tapped into a lot of supports and partnerships at Capital Region BOCES. We have a partnership with Parsons and Northern Rivers mental health clinics. And so 8 of our districts have those support people in district as well. And we've been able to leverage those people to be part of that all on hand deck effort. We've, just to shift the question a little bit more, as Joe said, when we started contemplating opening schools for ESY, we've been talking a lot about opening schools in the fall as well. And one of the things that we have started to talk through is that importance of when we bring faculty and staff and when we bring students back to pay attention to the mental health, the social emotional, and not just jump back into the academics. We're not going to be able to just jump right back in. We're going to need to help students transition transition in and help reacclimate them. And, it's going to be a whole new normal for them. So not even just supporting them as they transition back into school, but supporting them with what that transition now looks like.
And I think to that point, Lauren, with the transition, I think paying attention to the social emotional health of the students is important, but the adults too in the system. This is hard. This is as hard or harder for a lot of teachers and related service providers. My wife is a physical therapist in a school district. Try doing PT over Zoom. So one of the things that we did, like Slofsky's folks helped a lot with, was trying to gather information and support for those other folks in addition to the teachers. So, even borrowing from telemedicine, how does the school nurse interact with kids? How does the physical therapist, the occupational therapist? So I think it's interesting if we kind of think back, it was a big push at the beginning about regular school. And then kind of as our conversation went here today, then it gets into students with disabilities, English language learners, and eventually, working our way to our most needy population. So I think we ignore the adults at our peril too.
Just one more thing to jump in. We keep talking about also what are the things that have happened while we've been in this situation that we want to see move forward. And one of the things that I have seen happen is that our faculty and staff and providers are seeking to understand from parents much more than before. So we all know that every student is living in a different environment. And, sometimes when there's been issues before, we call the parents in and we tell them what we want them to do. And so this has kind of flipped that script of everybody reaching out and connecting with parents and students and saying, help me understand where you are right now so that I can meet you and support you. And I think that's one of those things that we really need to see moving forward is more of us not telling parents, they were the first educators of their children, but really listening to parents and then moving together to support our students the very best way we can.
Yeah, very important points, and Mike, just to underscore your staff piece, which we're having conversations with. I mean, nationally, it's projected that 30 to 35% of the teaching force won't come back to work, even when it's quote unquote okay to. We're already seeing that in our region, and we know it's safety concerns regarding the virus itself, but there are also a lot of other pieces attached to that. I just want to go a little bit deeper, and I know we're going to be very short on time, so just kind of wrap around this a little bit, and then we'll get to the last question. But we're talking about the supports, we're talking about those pieces. It's interesting when we went to the not be at physical school locations, it was constant, how are we going to feed kids? But it wasn't questions about how are we going to give kids therapy. When the school closed and a child and a family received their psychiatric or mental health services in the school through one of our partners, that question didn't come up. So knowing that deficit, knowing that obviously we have seen some children fall behind, and I'll quickly make this twofold. One from a K-12 or essentially a 9-12 perspective to Lauren, and a higher ed perspective to Peter. What is the work and how's the work occurring really in sum to make sure that students or children are on the path they need, especially as they were so close to the finish line in many cases? And Peter, we'll start with higher ed, please.
So are you talking about measuring student progress to ensure, is that the question? John?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. I think it's an interesting question in higher ed. For the most part, the higher ed classes have been carried out in learning management systems, and there's a huge transition from classroom to online. So there's been I think a transition to a certain extent in the way that we're assessing student learning from typical classroom monitored performance assessments to online assessments, where the online environment has certain affordances and certain drawbacks. Some of the drawbacks are raised when we start to think about academic integrity. So we've had to think about alternative means of assessment that are less open to violations of academic integrity, and also provide additional tools to faculty as they need them to ensure academic integrity. But I think in the higher education space, many of the practices that we've been carrying out in the classroom have just been transitioned to online, and there's been a certain number of adjustments. I think there's been a certain amount of flexibility in policies and practices. We've allowed students to, for example, elect to have either an A through F grading scheme or a pass-fail grading scheme right up to the end of the semester, in recognition of the significant challenges that students are confronting, many with limited access to courses, limited access to their instructors. We've just made many different kinds of adjustments in the transition from classroom to online.
Great, Peter, thank you. And obviously it's very dynamic, it's very organic too, is the way that folks have been able to manage those transitions and, to your point, making sure that the progress monitoring that technically what happened in the face-to-face classroom continues in that environment. And Lauren, just to put a bow on the K-12 piece, with, especially as we've been dealing with many policies coming from the Board of Regents regarding credits and seat time and all those things, just real quick about how making sure, especially kids, again, we're getting close to graduation, making sure that no student candidly was harmed by policy that was put in place to potentially impact their academic record.
Sure, absolutely. As soon as, SED came out with the Regents exemption, we were able to move forward pretty quickly with that. Again, using essential ed and different resources, we had been working with teachers to focus in on what that essential content they could teach from that point to the end of the year. And that's really how we measured students completing the course and receiving local credit. To Peter's point, as he said, grading was a conversation. And so no child was going to fail in this situation because, again, we don't know the environment and all of the hurdles that they were going through to sign in and do their coursework each day. So we did collection of evidence around those skills and standards, and then decided that even if a student wasn't able to meet that local credit, that we will give them time this summer to be able to make up that learning and obtain that credit at the end. Our counselors, our higher school principals, we worked with them to unpack the regulations, and they started with seniors and worked their way all the way down with 9th grade to ensure that every student was accounted for, that their pathway to graduation, that they knew exactly what needed to happen, and that children weren't going to be harmed in this.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. I know regionally that work has been ongoing, and especially as we're looking to celebrate graduations coming up, and the various requirements around all those things that folks have been wrestling with. And I think as a region, the superintendents, principals, et cetera, have done a really great job managing that. We're getting to a close, so I will just ask real quickly, in 15 seconds or less, if we can do a quick go around, lesson learned. What do you think, especially so we get back to our root of equity and access, and we talked about what that looks like across so many different opportunities and different circumstances that everyone faces. So real quick, one lesson learned, and we'll bounce around, and how about we start with Alex? There you go, Alex.
Yeah, I think there's this awareness about this digital equity or inequities in our school system, and how do you teach diverse learners in the remote learning or remote mode. I think teachers have become more aware. The teachers are now aware that the what they call the differentiated learn instruction to meet the needs of all learners in a remote mode or learning, that awareness has been hyping up or has increased. And I think in the future, there's going to be more focus on how do I teach students of color or minority students using the internet or using Google Classroom. I think that strategy is now what is going to go ahead now. It used to be face-to-face. There was more to do with multicultural education. But I think now that most classes are going to be in remote learning, that the same focus is going to be, attention has been created on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Alex. Mike Dowdy.
Well, I would echo what Alex says. I think you have to dig the well before you're thirsty. And I think what we found out here is that not all of our teachers were ready to go with the tools that they either had at their disposal or were going to start using. So my push would be for widespread professional development, school districts deciding on their essential systems, making sure everybody knows how to use them. And this could very well be the end of snow days, because kids could just work and teachers could just work from home when it snows.
Can you imagine, huh? We've been arguing it for years. Here it is on our doorstep. Thank you, Mike. Mike Solowski.
I would just make one quick point about, because this has been discussed in a lot of circles, at least in the ed tech world, is equity and access. Equity does not equal access. And it's important to recognize that. So, and I think a good example that was presented recently was everyone can have access to the technology, but if there are situations where it isn't in multiple languages, or it isn't in a format that's appropriate for the student with disabilities, then you may be providing equal access, but you're not necessarily providing them with digital equity. And we need to be really mindful that it is more than just making sure we get all the tools in their hands, but rather are the tools presented in such a way that all students can equitably learn in those environments.
No question, Mike. That's a really great point, and I think something that may even deserve its further probing among the group as well. And it's often overlooked, because just because somebody can get there doesn't mean they can understand or be able to partake in or learn from what's going on. Peter, I'll turn to you.
I would say, if anything, every crisis represents an opportunity. And the opportunity that we have now is a very bright light has been shined on inequitable access and lack of equity in education, in both higher education and in K-12 environments. And we should not squander this opportunity to address those issues of access and equity. We need a broad and deep planning exercise in addressing the issues of access to internet. Many of our students who are at remote were dependent on, if they didn't have access in their homes, they had access in libraries, but everything was shut down. We need to address those kinds of issues broadly. The tools that students need, hardware, laptops, computers, other digital tools. This has shined a very bright spotlight on the fact that not all students have access to these tools equitably. So in every crisis, there's an opportunity. We should not squander this opportunity to address.
Absolutely. No question. Thank you, Peter. And we'll close with Lauren. Some thoughts? Lessons learned?
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the ones that we keep coming back to is grading opportunities. We talk about equity, and we talk about the way that every teacher almost has a different standard for how they approach and grade different situations. And, that came through very clear as we had over 200 faculty members assist us with creating our Essential Ed website. And so, it's all tied together, right? Understanding our standards and presenting our instruction in different ways so all students have access, and then grading that in a way that allows students to not just receive a grade, but really engages them in the learning and helps promote their interest and growth as an individual.
Yeah, imagine grading practices changing out of this too, huh?
Yep.
So many, it's really caused so much motion down so many different roads. So at this point, I'll turn it back to Jason or Jerry to close things.
Well, thank you, Joe. We're thrilled that this was such a great conversation today to move things forward, and delighted again by this partnership with you all at Cap Region BOCES. And what a great opportunity to think about sort of P1220 approaches to what we're all grappling with. So, stay connected with us. You saw the dates earlier. We'll be doing another one of these coming up in July. We hope that you'll join us for that. Otherwise, we will see you all soon, and we'll let you have the rest of your evening back. So thank you all, and take care.